join us. So obviously a big question on everyone's mind is when is this stuff going to be real? When is it actually going to be running? One of the difficulties in my position is I don't get to actually have my hands in production systems. At Hyperledger, we're kind of the consortium that brings together the IP, but we really depend upon our community, our participants to boil that down into running systems. And it's not always easy to get people to talk about kind of what they're working on because sometimes people would rather make mistakes in the dark, right? But as we grow these industries, I think it's really important that where there are lessons that we can learn from each other, that we're talking about that, whether they're successes or almost successes, right? So with that, I wanted to bring up a panel to talk about blockchain in the wild, and I will let the panel take a seat, and we can go through and introduce ourselves. Thank you very much. Yep. Oh, great. Great. So why don't we just go down the panel here and have each of you introduce yourselves, talk about kind of your company's experience with blockchain technology, kind of just like the highlights of it, and a quick observation that you want to share and make sure that we cover during the course of this conversation. So why don't we start with you?
All right. My name is Jesse Chenard. I'm one of the founders of a company called Monetigo. We are a blockchain solution and middleware provider. We've been doing a lot of work in developing nations around the world, primarily in India. Our real approach is how does blockchain integrate with existing systems? Everybody's talking about going to production with these things. And we realize that central banks aren't going to be changing their approach anytime soon, or their settlement reports or their processes. So how do we bring them into the ecosystem, and how do we get the registrations done for regulatory purposes? How do we streamline the existing processes while we slowly change them to a more, I think, advanced platform, which we see blockchain being? So our work primarily is with banks, but we also do a lot of work with central banks and the clearing and settlement houses to give them some education, give them some early learnings. Our real approach with them is don't change anything right now. Just put a note in, or even let us figure out a way to use your existing payment and settlement system so that we can build more complex applications on top of that.
My name is Ashwin Kumar. I am responsible for product and business development for Deutsche Börse. At Deutsche Börse, we've been experimenting with blockchain now for a couple of years. We started off with a couple of very small prototypes, and then we sort of took a step back and we thought about what was required from an ecosystem perspective for us to be able to use this technology on a large-scale basis within our different business units. As a result of which, we have 3 different initiatives that we are currently working on. One is an initiative with the Deutsche Bundesbank, whereby we're looking at settlement of securities against a central bank issued coin. Another initiative that we're working on is with a group of other CSDs, whereby we're looking at cross-border collateral management and transformation across multiple jurisdictions using blockchain technology. And the third initiative that we are also running right now is the issuance of an ECAG, or a clearinghouse coin, which will enable banks to bring commercial bank money onto the blockchain and enable it to then have the commercial bank credit expansion on the blockchain as well.
Well, my name is Ram Kamaraju. I work for CLS Bank, where I'm responsible for innovation and technology delivery related to that. CLS Bank sits at the center of the FX market. On any given day, we settle about $5 trillion worth of foreign exchange transactions in 18 different currencies. We have 66 settlement members, as well as 23,000 plus third parties settling their FX rates through our system. Well, the reason that we are here, or I'm here today, is because we're launching a production service, or we're planning to launch a service in 2018, and we're right in the middle of working through that. It's called CLS-Net, which standardizes the bilateral netting processes for those trades that currently don't get settled through CLS. This is a global service offering. We're right in the midst of it, and I'm willing to share the experiences as we go through the discussion today.
Good afternoon. I'm Corey Tadaro. I'm the COO of Hashed Health, which is a health IT innovation startup out of Nashville, Tennessee. We're a group of health IT veterans and hospital operator veterans who've come together to explore and work with the stakeholders in the healthcare community for blockchain implementations to solve well-known, well-defined, and otherwise intractable business problems in the administration and payment of healthcare. Having worked at a very large health system, 28 hospitals in 6 states with substantial insurance business as well, I've lived the problems of trying to move the data, trying to make the transaction more efficient. Our initial use cases this year primarily focused around the administration of provider information and provider identity, which is normally an administrative issue, but with blockchain we can make it into an identity solution. We're also exploring an alternative payments model that's enabled by blockchain. So this is beyond fee-for-service claims administration, looking at some of the fee-for-value alternatives to fee-for-service, which have been experimented with over the past couple of years, but have hit some well-known walls around reconciliation, although we use that language differently in healthcare. That normally takes place a year after the delivery of healthcare for fee-for-value. So we're talking about episodic care, bundled payment initiatives, quality care initiatives. How can we move those transactions into real time, primarily? And we're also working substantially on some public health initiatives, which primarily involve the coordination of multiple stakeholders, the coordination of resources to address communities, low-resource communities, both domestically and globally.
My name is Dave Treat. I lead the blockchain practice for Accenture, globally for financial services, and I'm the deputy head firm-wide, which gets me out of my financial services box and into all sorts of new industries, which is a lot of fun. I have to apologize, though, Brian. I just literally came from a session where I talked about, you and I have an ongoing dialogue around the importance of gender equality on panels, and I just said how much I know it's at your heart.
Panel, but yeah,
I know, but I know it's how much at the heart of what we've talked about, and I know it's at the heart, your heart and core.
Yeah.
So that was my delay on getting on stage. Was I was like, hey Amber, do you want to just stay on stage for a minute? Because it is so important. And I just apologize to all the folks that I just literally called you out as being. I really respect that of you, and so
Yeah, thank you.
and I'm trying to emulate it. So
and let's-
apologies for all.
Let's put together a program to help fix this.
Yes, we need to, and that was the focus of that whole session. So,
Good.
Sorry.
Thank you, David.
Anyway, so in terms of
So with that, now you have to tell us about which of your projects are
Yes.
in pilot or production mode. No.
Yes. Yeah. So we are. So naturally, right. So we're the world's largest independent, and that's the operative word, independent tech services company. So we fiercely defend not having a product. We focus on working through our client relationships, our industry knowledge, our ability to go to a client and say, look, we understand how different new technologies will apply to how you need to transform and how we can do that with you. And then it's our partnerships with all of the startups, the traditional tech players, the consortium and ecosystems where we bring that constellation of capabilities together to then work with clients to drive that. So we have we now have an enormous number of pilots and POCs cutting across industries. We've gotten our entire client relationship account structure in place. But if I call out a few of them, we've got some really interesting things going on within capital markets around clearing and settlement, within the payment space, within the insurance space. If I get out of financial services, and I know I'm rattling off all the usual suspects, but between supply chain, trade finance, digital rights management as one that's really firing up. Health is huge. And so I guess one thing that I would call out maybe specifically is, it's the topic of the next panel, is work that we're doing now around identity as an underpinning key catalyst to all of those use cases, whether it's the identity of an individual, a group of individuals, a thing, a computer, et cetera. So it's been a huge theme of this conference, and we're very focused on it and starting to actually develop.
So do any of us have something that we would call a blockchain in production yet? Okay, this is fine, which I don't think that puts us out of the
We're about to
ordinary
get there.
here. No, we're working on it, right? So what would you say is like the biggest barrier right now to getting any of the active POCs you have to production?
So I clarified. I think one of the discussions that we get into a lot, and a question I got asked is, the tipping point. When is this going to be
Yes.
real? And one of the things to focus on, and again, I don't want to call anyone out prematurely, but the thing that really, there are things that are in production environments. But so we have something that's in a production environment technically, and that it's dealing with real value and moving it, and it's doing real things in production.
Yeah.
But it's at such a small scale. I didn't jump at the question. I don't answer that question and say yes, we're in mass scale production and adoption is underway.
Mass scale is
we're
different.
nowhere near
No,
that.
But production.
But
I'll define production as you are exchanging assets of real value. Somebody's ox will get gored if this does fail, right? And where the only barrier between this and growing to scale is the DevOps side of getting enough transactions per second and that sort of thing, but that the business tension, the business workflows have been sorted out. And it's an MVP, but it's still production, minimum viable production, I guess.
Well, my opinion is that, specifically with respect to Hyperledger Fabric, for example, we've been working through with IBM, who is the leading developer for that software, as well as the community. It's just a matter of that software maturing. And the point also is that I don't think that there is a barrier per se at this point. It's just a matter of using the technology to solve a real business problem, right? And that's going to take some time. The other thing I would just add, though, is that for distributed ledgers, unlike other applications where you can just install the software in your company and you have potentially an edge, in this particular case, you need a network effect. So I think somebody coined this term, so I cannot take the credit for this. The term was minimally viable ecosystem, right? You need an ecosystem. So if each party is trying to get an edge in a distributed ledger technology platform on their own, and each of these business cases don't necessarily by themselves on day one, it's going to be justifying that.
Is there a rule of thumb for how many different organizations constitute a minimally viable ecosystem?
Well, I think this ecosystem is actually a very important aspect. I mean, at Deutsche Börse, we run a variety of highly regulated trading venues and clearing venues and post-trade venues, et cetera. And all of these have one thing in common, which is we're highly regulated. And in order to bring in any of these new technologies, whereas the regulators don't regulate the technology per se, but they regulate us, we have to demonstrate that these are technologies that are ready for use and fit the bill. And we're just not there yet in terms of the underlying
Do you think the regulators would not allow you to launch something that had 5 market participants because they would be concerned that that was too limited? It needs to be able to be opened up to the 25,000 or something?
To me, 5 market participants is not a real production version. That's a POC, right? I mean, that's really not something for an organization our size is of any scale. It's not going to make a difference.
Okay.
So I think when you're looking for those use cases, it probably behooves to pick something that doesn't necessarily ring serious alarm bells. This is still an evolving technology. So for example, to use the example of CLSNet, that's the use case that we picked. It doesn't involve moving of the cash. It's also a real business problem. In fact, the business case had its own legs, whether we use DLT or not. But we thought that's a thoughtful way of introducing a new technology that's not yet been proven in a production environment in a market-critical way.
So there are these techniques. So I've heard of Everledger implementing something called a shadow chain, right, where they use a chain to kind of emulate what's going on in kind of a paper-based or kind of non-blockchain-oriented way now, just to make sure that transaction rates can keep up, but perhaps to add a layer of transactional integrity to a system that didn't have that before. Is that a technique that you've seen used in places?
So that's definitely see it in healthcare.
Yeah.
No one is going to take themselves off of their very badly constructed systems and set sail on the Hyperledger ship or any other blockchain ship for a while now. And to address your earlier question, our barrier in healthcare is familiarity with the technology. I mean, we at Hashed Health, we have 2 conference sets. We have blockchain conferences like this, where we have no customers in the room, or hardly any customers. Healthcare companies, hospital companies, technical middlemen, pharmaceutical manufacturers, they're not here. So we're on a panel full of financial people. So that's a real barrier for us, and we're having to address that through some intensive market education. And there's some very wariness around that as well. And that wariness is going to translate into us having to do shadow approaches as we convene what we call a minimally viable network, depending on the transaction set there. And so it's a very conservative industry, and we're going to have to go through that process with them. But we're trying to push that as fast as possible.
David, did you want to comment on the shadow chain?
Yeah, just a funny dynamic. We've had a couple of clients now that that have basically said, look, we're at the point we see the use case, we can envision a minimally viable ecosystem. We want to get building. We want to start by wrapping our heads around the technology. We'll spin it up for our in internal. Essentially, let's get ourselves off of a mainframe infrastructure. Let's spin it up. Let's get the data either in parallel or start to port over. And then suddenly we have two instances now, and it's against kind of a lot of my early kind of just focus on ecosystems. The internal use case is a red herring. You should be under the same trust model and governance. These two clients have found value in it. And so there's, in a very funny, frustrating sort of way of like they're saying, no, we've got a lot of value by actually getting ourselves off of mainframe and our screwed up data infrastructure and the processes, and we've never been able to get our business lines to coordinate and agree. And actually, we've got value in the internal by just spinning up a distributed data system internally. Right. And so I'm trying to change my attitude a little bit and say, okay, fine, maybe we can, we'll get some value there. But still trying to push you got to think about the ecosystem.
But does this shadow chain approach run the risk, and maybe there's other ways of expressing this, of limiting what people might do with the blockchain? I mean, if there's a chance to reinvent how these business processes work, does the conservatism of some of these industries keep us from actually being able to get from a broken, old but still running system to a new system if there's too much process change in the way?
And I think that takes time. So by shadowing the existing systems, you gain this platform that you can do a whole bunch more with. The distributed nature of it, the ability to disseminate information securely and access-based permission. But with the central banks we work with, they're supportive of the work we're doing with the bank, but they've sort of said, look, in maybe 2 or 3 years, we'll do a proof of concept on this. Once we see it running, once we are comfortable with the technology, once maybe another central bank dives in first. So I think, the shadowing notion, I think, is the biggest thing that's getting us seeing close to production systems, in this year. By going and saying we need to do a wholesale change of everything, as the Chief General Manager for Payments and Settlements of the RBI said to me, she said, that on my desk over there is the paper net settlement report that I sign every night. That's the settlement report in India for the next couple of years.
Right.
So until they get the mindset change, I think it's the baby step. It's getting the foot in the door. And to Dave's point too, one of the banks we're working with has been trying internal stuff, and so they actually have an application where they're doing it for internal requisition approvals. Because right now it's an email system and verbal approvals, and they want an audit trail at the end of the year. So they've said, can we do this? And we're like, yeah, you could. So we're supporting them on that. And they've got more advanced use cases too, like for interbank loans where they want to attach the contract to the actual real-time gross settlement for reconciliation purposes later or disputes. So I think it's to the point of what's holding us back. I think a lot of it has been trying to sell too much to everyone. And what we found, and possibly trying to introduce too many people into the ecosystem at once. So when we started our blockchain consortium in India, there was 12 banks and 10 different use cases, and the retail banking and the commercial banking departments. And what we've started to do is just slim it down and say, okay, you like this use case, we're going to work with the National Payments Corporation with you. You like this use case, we're going to integrate real-time gross settlement with you folks. You guys like the use case of taxation registrations, we'll integrate it with you as a bank. And then as we start to do that, we've got a blockchain running. It's all on the Hyperledger fabric, so it's got a common infrastructure. But right now, each of them is only getting that one single simple use case capability. And then at the end of it, we open it up to the whole ecosystem. So that's how we're trying to grow the ecosystem out, by individually focusing on them, but giving them the common platform, and then with the promise.
And the regulators weren't holding that back? I mean, what role were they playing? I mean, obviously India is a different market than other places, but do you kind of get in by supplanting existing use cases and business processes and then?
So in some cases it's, well, first of all, India with the demonetization and their push for financial
an interesting time there for sure,
yeah. They've been pushing the banks very hard, so we've got a very receptive audience there. But for the most part, they want to see this change. They want to be able to do true financial aid out to the farmers and things like that. And right now, with the cost of KYC, the cost of getting people banked, getting them to a bank, with all that sort of stuff, it's just not possible for them to do. So the regulators in India have actually been, everyone has said, oh my God, it's a nightmare to do business over there. We've got executive support at the RBI level. We've got, everyone is pretty much pushing us to go as fast as we possibly can. And we've seen that now. We're operating in opening up a couple networks in Africa and in smaller countries there. Same thing. We just sort of took our playbook from India, said, hey, do you guys want an immediate payment system? Do you want the ability for push-pull payments, the ability for information settlement attached to your payments? And they actually have moved quicker. One of the countries has moved quicker than it's taken us for a year in India, and they're ready to deploy. So I think it's from a regulatory standpoint, our approach has been, don't change anything today. We're going to integrate with your real-time gross settlement systems. We're going to integrate with your existing filing systems. Over time, we're going to make them better with you. But right now, this is sort of the sandbox we get to play in.
Ashwin, how would you compare this to the kind of the regulatory environment in developed markets and being able to take then, again, POCs and pilots to runtime? Does this end up creating an advantage for developing market regulatory environments?
I think in the case of developing markets, particularly like India, et cetera, which is going through a transformational shift in terms of the underlying population and bringing them onto a banking segment, there's clear application that will probably move it faster. But in our experience, we found our regulators to be extremely open, extremely cooperative, extremely engaging on this topic. As I mentioned, we're doing a joint project with the Deutsche Bundesbank, who is one of our regulators. So from our perspective, we've found all of our regulators to be extremely interactive. But if I could also just step back 1 second on the shadowing that you mentioned, I think there's a big risk that we run as an industry with the shadowing concept, which is we have different parties that are providing different protocols, and one institution is using multiple providers with different protocols to do different aspects of their build out internally. I think we can end up with competing protocols or protocols that don't really talk to each other, with a spaghetti bowl similar to what we have today, just with a blockchain technology. And that's something we as an industry have to manage much better than we are right now.
Yeah, I would actually say that one of the other problems with shadowing approach, for example, is that I've seen this in a few other banks, and what typically happens is, okay, we have 6 systems trying to do the same thing. Okay, how about creating a 7th system which will replace these all, but it's going to run in this prod parallel mode, and lo and behold, 2 years later, you have a 7th system. You have 7 systems that are just running, right?
There was somebody on the first system who wouldn't give that up, and yeah.
And then instead of 2 years later, it'll be 7 systems. Now you're looking to create the 8th.
So what are techniques?
Sorry.
Was there a question?
No.
Oh, so how would you address that in the POC and pilot phase? Is there something you can identify that might keep that from happening?
See, I think one thing, my opinion is that we should try to avoid boil the ocean solutions, because they look really transformative. They're great from when you're just trying to do a POC. For example, it's very easy to envision a system where you capture the trade as soon as it's been executed directly from the ECN, capture it onto the ledger. You implement the full life cycle of the product on the ledger. That sounds great, right? Because you can immediately get rid of hundreds, if not thousands, of systems that are duplicated across the global financial industry. The difficulty with that, of course, is that all those systems have been integrated very tightly to the bank's internal systems. So it looks very great on a piece of paper, and you could do it as a POC. But in order for something like that to take effect and go into production, I wouldn't bet. I would actually like to take the bets on the opposite side for something like that, right? So in my opinion, you have to try to look for use cases like the way you've explained it earlier. Pick those things that would solve real problems. They may not be really glamorous, earth-shattering, but you are solving a real business problem. And once you have that in place, you can use that platform to deliver more products on it. Because if you think of a blockchain or a distributed ledger, what is it? At the end of the day, once you create the platform, what you have is a piece of business logic in the chain code, in Fabric speak, and then state on the ledger, and maybe some thin layer that's interfacing into the systems. Once you have this, you can launch other products, other services on top of it. And the barrier to entry for the subsequent services is lower, and the cost of entry as well.
Sounds like a lot of the same arguments for the adoption of cloud computing over the last 10 years as well. Start with the mundane, start with your DNS servers and email services and things like that, and then get to more core business process systems. Yeah.
I think the other thing is I think we're entering a new phase overall too, because I think there was a necessary phase where we had to do a bunch of POCs and prototypes because everyone wanted to learn the technology, right, by touching it, right? Not having it described to you, not seeing it on PowerPoint, but everyone wanted to have their teams gain a degree of experience and spin up the technology, and it almost didn't matter, right? What technology, what it was.
As long as that blockchain
as long as it had,
at the bottom of the screen where the blocks come
right.
out.
I'll try not to make the mauve joke, but yeah, but we went through a phase where that was part of the learning curve, right? I think we've actually now tipped where organizations now don't need that part of the learning curve, and they're actually going back to getting into a phase where we can do it right? Which is you know enough about the technology to know what it can do, but actually you're going to think through the overall strategy of the business ecosystem you sit in, and the degree of messaging that happens back and forth between your counterparties, all in functional terms and business relationship terms, to say, actually, I can imagine an outcome here where this is tremendously simplified if I eliminate messaging between counterparties, and actually if we had a shared data construct and get through a whole phase where you're designing that end state, and then getting to, okay, which technology will fit, rather than where we've been, which is, I picked a technology, let me see if I can fit it.
Can you pin a percentage out of thin air that kind of describes like the percent of time spent on defining that business process, that use case, and all the complex kind of politics of getting everybody on board with that model, and then the amount of time and effort to implement on any given technology stack?
Yeah, it's really funny that there's a couple of modes, right? So there's a mode where there's a player that sits centrally and they're a de facto consortium already, right? So Rob's still here, right? I mean, so DTCC is a consortium that's already very, arguably the most successful consortium to date, right? Painfully put together, but really very, been operating as a consortium for a long time. A central player like that can build something and bring its participants to it, and that's a model. And that can be done more quickly because you have a central actor acting in that role on behalf of its consortium that's already used to that model. Right. Where you're starting from a business ecosystem where there is no natural central provider and there is no natural, then the hard part is getting the folks together, getting the different corporates and enterprises together to agree what that imagine-if scenario could be, and getting competitors and horizontal and vertically integrated groups of folks together to say, yes, there is something really special here. Sometimes that's happening quickly, right? Or relatively quickly, right? So B3I, right? 15 reinsurance companies got together, and in decent speed, off of the back of a couple of acting quickly, they got together fast, right? And are now going to start to do interesting things, and they'll spin up lots of different projects. Others are slower to form. So I think it's really industry by industry specific, and it's player by player specific. Is there a catalyst to get?
I guess what I'm trying to get at though is also like how important is it to select a particular technology platform early in this kind of discovery and then POC and pilot phase, and then how much does that constrain certain characteristics of what you're designing, or how much can it be kind of what you do in the latter quarter of the entire project?
Yeah, so for me, it's not the latter quarter, okay. But if you're going to do something real and serious and impact and drive a serious business transformation, I'm in consulting, right? So it's you're at a minimum you should spend the 8 to 12 weeks, with your leadership team, thinking through your role in a business ecosystem, and ideally engaging with either upstream, downstream, or peers to do the same. That never happens in sooner than a few months.
Sounds like a really existentialist kind of process. Redefining who you are in the world. Right?
But isn't it, right? I mean, we're breaking a 60-year-old model. Right? For the past 60 years since databases were invented, we've been locked in this business model of I can't trust your data and you can't trust mine. So I'm going to build my systems, you're going to build your systems, and we're going to reconcile back and forth with each other.
Does it require having like a therapist on?
It does.
Like a
Exactly. Yeah.
I think to answer your question though, you're a business consultant, I'm a technologist at heart. So my answer is going to be biased with technology as well. A lot of what's possible and what we think of business process today exists because of the technology limitations or the implementation that underpinned them historically in the last 20, 25 years. So the fact that there is a confirmation process that happens between two banks for a given trade, Now, if you were to talk to a business person, let's say, and say, oh, why is the confirmation important? And can we take that away? The concept of confirmation is important, but the fact that you have these messages manually being exchanged with each party or with the central party in the middle doesn't need to exist if you have a distributed ledger in the place. So when we are looking to re-engineer systems or when we are trying to change and improve our processes, it's good to have an understanding of what's possible with these technologies. So it's not necessarily that technology is driving the solutions, but you have to know what is possible with the new things that we have, new toolkit.
Right.
I would say I feel fortunate that healthcare is much earlier on, and we get to learn from what you all have been doing the past couple of years. But I will say, as we think about point solutions or proof of concepts that we're building right now, our concern is we can imagine broader and broader use cases for these initial data models that we're building and implementing onto platforms like Fabric. And one of our limitations is we don't know where it's going. So there are things we would like to do, and the question always remains, well, we'll be able to do it with this platform? Maybe, maybe not.
Right. Well, and in the spirit established by Dave early in this panel of calling a spade, where have there been challenges, whatever technology platform you've been working with, where has the hype not met the reality? Where have POCs kind of faltered? And how has that hurt the progress towards getting to production with some of these systems?
I don't know if it's technology. I think it's bad business use case design. There are so many things you could do on a blockchain, which even while better than the current systems, the incremental value of which is meaningless given the $10 million you've already invested.
And I would agree with that. I don't think it's necessarily the technology. I think the technology, different technologies have slightly different variations, but at the end of the day, they achieve pretty close to the same thing. But where it falls down in a lot of times is getting consensus, not only internally but externally, and that's where to go to David's point, which is where the network is really important when it comes to actually rolling out these technologies, and is to get that standardization of thought process, of implementation process, of technology, etc. Market infrastructure or centralized players are the ones that are in a unique position with the network to achieve that kind of those kind of applications. So it's not necessarily the technology, it's more the participants.
Okay.
So I might not give you totally negative information, but I could spend a couple of minutes just taking you through the journey that we went through. Okay. And we are still in the process of going through launching our service into production, right? So back in August of last year, July of last year, when 0.5 or 0.6 version of the Fabric was still being built out, we knew that functionality as it existed couldn't meet our requirements, right? But at the same time, we could see the potential, the fact that there is an open-minded community that we could work with, and we could see 1.0 could be on the horizon, right? At least people did acknowledge the fact that the solution as it existed at the time does not necessarily meet the requirements for the financial market industry, the capital markets. So we had worked with IBM, for example, in this particular case, because they were contributing quite a bit of the source code there. We kind of made sure that we had an alignment in the general direction that we're going. So that was the understanding based on which we made a public announcement that we would be going live with CLSnet as a production service. And over the next few months, this is the thing to realize, right? It turned out to be a great partnership, but the reality is we had to work through so many details through the community. And then even as of March this year, when we started integrating the various pieces together, Fabric as a whole was, whatever tests that were being done in the code base, it was being done in a very limited fashion, whereas our use case demanded multiple nodes, real different nodes, and we were taking advantage of all the features like channels really to take advantage of the confidentiality. There are quite a few features that we were taking advantage of, and we were finding those defects as we were running into them. And some of them were really blockers. You couldn't actually proceed further. So we'd spent quite a bit of time resolving those things. I'm glad to say that right now we're in a stable position. The point that I just want to highlight is that this is not going to be a very smooth journey, and you need to be able to we committed a few defect fixes onto the source code base as well. the thing is, if you're planning to do something serious in this space, you need to remember that you have to find the right partner and who is willing to be staying with you along the journey, and be active in the community and make sure that whatever your serious needs are going to be addressed.
And in fact, CLS has been very active in the community even then. I do want to open it, we just have a few minutes. I don't know if there are any questions from the audience about the topics. Yes, here in the front.
In the POCs you folks have you done it in isolation or tried to interface with legacy systems like SAP or?
Question was, in the work that's been done in the pilots or POCs, have you tried to integrate with legacy systems like SAP, et cetera?
So in our case, yeah, I mean, our integration is done with the payment systems, but also then on the core banking system side of things is it's a touchy situation for these banks opening up their core banking systems, and how do you get access to the ledger? Our methodology has been to, again, not get them to change anything, taking their payment messages as they're going out and translating them into transactions, and on the other side doing the same thing. So yeah, I mean, I think that the integration with the legacy systems is key because they're not going away in the next year or two.
Yeah, doing the happy path prototype build, it couldn't be easier, right? I mean, it's really no stop. That's quick and easy, and it's weeks, right? The most interesting things are when you get into the actual integration into production systems, and then we early on we bumped into the from a key management perspective, how are you going to integrate into our de facto standard in financial services and in health around HSM infrastructure, right? Keys and application layers, no, not going to happen. Like, how are you going to get blockchain-based systems, DLT systems to have key management happen as does today in HSM infrastructure? It's those really interesting conversations and activities that I think are a lot of the effort, right? So it's a great question, and it's where if you don't if you do POCs without that part of the learning curve, you're missing out. A lot of fun.
Any closing thoughts? Because I think we have just about 30 more seconds. Okay, great. Well, with that, I want to thank the panel for an enlightening conversation.